I guess the one prayer I'd ask for is tomorrow as Carrie and I start school. This is the longest we've gone. I personally have gone without being, teaching. Yeah, almost. And I had a student teacher since January. I had back-to-back student teachers. And so I really haven't taught since mid-January. And it's kind of strange going back. I feel super rusty. I was glad I did some training last week to get some of those. And today I'm going to practice on you all. As I was thinking, I was glad I got to do this the day before we started school. I was thinking, all right, what message to bring forward. I'm going to do something that's more of a teaching message to get me in the practice of starting back teaching tomorrow. And it'd be a very different year with mask wearing and all, but we will get through it. So if you have your Bible, if you go to 2 Kings 5, verse 1, I want to teach about this fellow named Naaman. So I'll wait to get there if you want to go there. 2 Kings 5, verse 1. And I'm pretty sure the version I'm using is ESV, but yours would be very similar, obviously. So 2 Kings 5, 1, verse 1. Verse 1 says this: Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now, this is somebody that probably a lot of people have not heard a lot of, the name Naaman. You're not sure really what he does or what he did. He's not a name that we hear about in Sunday school lessons or vacation Bible school. He's up there with the other names of the Bible. So I want to point out who he is. First off, he's a Syrian. Being a Syrian means he's not necessarily, he isn't a Jew. He's a Gentile. He's not one of God's chosen people. Matter of fact, he's commanding armies that are often hostile to the Israelites. He's Aramean. Aram is actually this land northeast of Israel. So in modern day Syria, the country of Syria is like directly north of Israel. Aram is a part of Israel that's northeast of Israel. He's the commander of this army of this area, a very popular man. He's a hero that's likely adorned with wreaths of victory, these laurel wreaths that they would adorn victors in battle. What's interesting about his victories is that the Lord is giving him victories, and some of them over the land of Israel, which is God's chosen people. Now, I highly, highly doubt that Naaman realizes this. I doubt that he realizes that God is clearing the path for his victories. And we aren't really told why God is doing this, but we can assume that God's setting the stage for something else. And it says that he's a man of valor, valor meaning great courage, especially in battle. He's called a man of valor. And we see this exact same word when they described Naaman, this exact same word to describe Gideon, Jeroboam, and David. Matter of fact, Naaman is the first Gentile, the first non-Jew, the first non-chosen person of God to get that same moniker of a man of valor. Bottom line, Naaman has a lot going on for him. His own name even means pleasant, which I thought was pretty cool. He's victorious. He's courageous. Like when I pass on, I would love for that to be said of me. Like on my tombstone, I would love it for it to be said, he was a brave, pleasant man, held in high favor, led to victory by the one true God. I think we'd all like that on our tombstone. I think that's pretty cool describing Naaman. And so there's a couple of things in just this one passage, verse 1, that we can kind of take from this. One is that God can use the saved and the unsaved for his purposes. Naaman isn't a saved person of Israel. He's not a Jew. He's not a chosen person of God. He's the commander of a heathen, pagan, idol-worshiping nation. And worse yet, the same nation is oppressing the people that were of God, the Israelites. And yet we see God using him for victory over and over again, and again, often against his own people. Why would God use someone who opposes him? And if you dig into history, you'll uncover why maybe God's doing this. It is believed that Naaman took out King Ahab of Israel. If you know anything about King Ahab of Israel, if you don't, I'll just give you just a quick little snippet of what he is. He was the one in the Bible that says that he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. I'm reading from Scripture. That's what it says about King Ahab. So here's Naaman and or his people taking King Ahab out. Likely King Ahab was, this is just a little side note I found interesting, likely King Ahab was very wicked because of who he married, which is true, I think, of any husband who turns bad, it's probably because I'm just kidding, it's not because who they marry. But this is true, he married a pagan princess named Jezebel. And so because of that, there was a lot of influence, but not to take away from King Ahab, he still made choices and did bad stuff. And so here we have the Syrians taking King Ahab out, likely led by Naaman. Now, it's not important whether he did or didn't, but scholars believe he did. God used this pagan, idol-worshiping, unchosen Naaman against King Ahab. So I think of this, who are we to say who God can and can't use for his purposes? We assume that it's only Christians that God's going to use for his purposes. We're putting God in this little box and saying, all right, you're just using Christians for his purposes, but we see throughout the Bible that he uses other people for his purposes. And that story tells me that happens. That's a false assumption. The second thing that I pulled from this is that very last the very last part, but let me get to that. It says, so Naaman is this commander of the king's army. He's this great man. He's regarded in high favor. And because of him, because of Naaman, God gave this idolatrous nation victory. But, it says right there, the last little part, but he was a leper. But he has this incredible disease that would slowly result in his death. Despite all the good things going on in his life, despite all that fantastic stuff, his days are numbered. His days are numbered, and he would die in a most horrible manner, leprosy. Leprosy, just to put it in perspective, it was a very, very loathsome disease. Very humiliating to have at the time. In ancient times, it was described that it would begin with these small red spots that would get bigger and bigger and turn white eventually. The spots would cover the entire body. The hair would fall out. We don't have leprosy, it's just we're naturally bald. The joints of the fingers and the toes would begin to rot, and eventually your appendages would fall out. And what you've probably heard about lepers with their body parts falling off. That's why, because your joints are rotting and those parts would fall off. Your gums would shrink to the point that they can't hold your teeth. And their teeth would obviously then just fall out. It wastes away your face until your nose, the mouth palate, and the eyes rot. Those who suffer from it would face this facial disfigurement where you're not even recognizable. Disfiguring your skin, your bones, twisting your limbs, curling your hands. So you would look like you have this claw. Very monstrous-like looking, if you're back in ancient times. Nerve damage so extensive that you would literally lose sensation of pain. Meaning that you could pick up a cup of boiling water and you wouldn't even flinch because you wouldn't feel it because those nerve sensations would be, not working. There was no cure. Death was certain. You literally would waste away to death. Biblically, and if you look in the book of Numbers, and don't turn there, I'm just giving you a little paraphrase, lepers were so despised, so loathed, that they would be ostracized. The lepers were not allowed within 6 feet of others, which I found strange, that social distancing thing, that's 6 feet. But it's true, you didn't want them near you. There was social distancing with lepers. You did not want them near you. They weren't even allowed 6 feet within their own family. In Leviticus, it describes the law dealing with lepers. Jewish law described how they were to be treated, showing how serious it was to be a leper, that it's prescribed in law. They had to wear torn clothing. They had to cover their upper lip. Wherever the leper went, he or she had to announce, unclean, unclean, just to show who they were. They had to wear black with a hood covering their face. They were so revolting, if the wind was blowing, you couldn't even come within 150 feet of them. It describes this in Leviticus, all these things dealing with these people, the lepers. You would live in a community with other lepers until one of two things happened. You got better or you died. And in particular cases, leprosy was viewed as punishment for sin. It's mentioned 68 different times in the Bible, and depending on the version you have, 55 times in the Old Testament, 13 times in the New Testament. Though I must mention that the term that they're using in leprosy is probably describing a whole host of other skin diseases, but it's very, very well understood in ancient times, and people realized its destructiveness. So it becomes this graphic illustration, this object lesson. When we read it through the Bible about dealing with leprosy, it's this destructive nature. It's this allegory of sin. Leprosy was incurable by man, just as sin is incurably bad, as the Bible states. We know that Naaman's leprosy was quite serious. And while he doesn't have to follow Levitical law, this guy's a Gentile, right? He's not Jew, so he's not having to follow the law that's in Leviticus. His own people still realize its seriousness. It's not a hoax. Like they realize, like, leprosy is the real deal. And he's subject to restrictions, and he's subject to quarantine. Okay, so know that even though his own people aren't having to follow that law that's in Leviticus, it's still really bad, and they realize it. Like, it's ugly. Now, that's just verse 1. Verses 2 and 3. Or verses 2 at least. 2 and 3. It says, "Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife." Verse 3. "She said to the mistress, 'Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy.'" So if you're tracking what just happened, there's this raid into Israel. You have the Syrian military raiding into Israel. This little girl gets kidnapped by the Syrians, which was very common. You would take people back, and they would come back as either, likely as servants. You would enslave them. They would also take stuff, goods. So you would bring back people to enslave and goods. So basically now this little girl is a slave in Naaman's household, which is actually a kind of a better place to be a slave. You want to be more of a household slave if you're going to be taken in battle. And she's specifically a servant to Naaman's wife. And she's like, "I know a prophet. Back in my land, there's this prophet, a prophet of God that could cure your husband." Right? Remember, this isn't Naaman's God. When she's pointing to the prophet of God, they're not talking about Naaman's God, Naaman and his wife. They're pagan. They're idol worshipers. So she's saying, "I have a prophet of my God who can cure you." Verse 4. "So Naaman went in and told his Lord, thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." Naaman's wife Naaman and his wife were taking this very seriously. And they're going to look into this opportunity. Honestly, we would too. Like if somebody told us, I know I have a cure for your incurable disease, we do that. We take any opportunity we can because we want cured, within reason. So he's saying, "Let's go. Let's do this because I want to be cured of this horrible disease." He's not above going to this other god. Remember, he's a pagan worshiper. This is just one other god amongst a host of gods. So he's going to see if this works out. Verse 5. "And the king of Syria said, 'Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel.' So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing." Now, I don't speak in terms of shekels and talents. I don't know what that means. It seems like a lot of gold. Even 1 shekel of gold would seem like a lot. So I had to look that up to see, how much is Naaman taking with him into the land of Israel? Because it seems like quite a bit. So I looked up the silver, the talent of silver. 10 talents of silver is 750 pounds of silver. Now, to give you perspective, that is like 1, 2, 3 of me standing here, piled with silver, and then more. I'm not, and more. I'm not that heavy. No, wait a second. What's 2 times 3 is 6? Yeah, 6. So 150 more. Yeah. Almost 4 of me. Because 4 of me would be 800 pounds roughly. So almost 4 of me of silver. That's quite a bit of silver. And the gold, 6,000 shekels of gold, that's 150 pounds of gold. I looked it up just yesterday, just to get the correct price. Today's prices, in just gold alone, which gold is up now because of the economy, which invest in gold. No, don't invest now. Wait until it goes down. Invest, then it'll go up. That's my tip. You should have invested in the stock market back in March. I'm just saying. Anyhow, $4.6 million just in gold alone. So here's the king of Syria, which I thought is amazing. The king of Syria giving Naaman, knowing Naaman's going off to seek some foreign god to get cured of leprosy. He's given him just a ton of money and a personal letter. Like a personal letter from the king and 10 gifted garments. Now, these garments aren't for Naaman. This isn't like his suitcase filled with clothing, packing up for 10 nights. These were personal touches. Gold and silver isn't personal. It's just money. Personal touches of clothing to go along with the cash. And no doubt this is like the best clothing, the king's garb, or, in his, something he had access to. So this is good stuff. Verse 6. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you to Naaman my servant, and that you may cure him of leprosy. It doesn't say there's a servant girl talking about some healing prophet. It assumes that the king can point him in the right direction. He's saying, here's this is Naaman, and we want him cured of leprosy. I'm figuring the king can just point him with the way to go. Verse 7. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. Right? So he thinks that he is to be the one to cure him of the leprosy. The letter doesn't mention this prophet. It doesn't say this little girl mentioned a prophet. And he tears his clothes. If you know anything about like that symbol of tearing your clothes, if you've read the Bible, you've probably heard that expression. We know Noah tore his garments at one point. It was this Jewish tradition to show grief. It would be to vent your pent-up anguish. And it's still done today in Jewish circles, but it's less spontaneous and it's more symbolic. Like at a funeral, at a Jewish funeral, the rabbi will what they call rend his garment, would be like cutting the garment as a symbolic show of anguish. The king is anguished. So why is the king of Israel so anguished? He's anguished because in his mind, the Syrian king thinks he has the power of God. And he is to cure Naaman of the leprosy. And he feels threatened because, he can't. Like, he can't cure him of leprosy because he's not a prophet of God. He's not God himself. He's not curing things. He's not a doctor, and there's no cure for leprosy. So his logical conclusion is this. He's asking me the impossible. He wants me to do what I can't do because I'm not God. And since I can't do it, what's the logical conclusion? He's going to come destroy me. He's just setting this up. And so keep in mind that this is his enemy. This isn't an ally. This isn't a friend. This is Aram, Syria in the north. That's his enemy. And he's got to be thinking, here we go. Here, this is it. He's giving me this impossible task. He's saying, do this, and I can't, so he's going to come destroy me. Verse 8. But when Elisha, not Elijah, Elisha, the Elisha, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. Hearing Elisha's name in this context is like the cavalry coming. Like this, for the king, like this is a rescue for him. When things seem dire, all of a sudden, here comes the hero, Elisha, coming to save the day. Note what is not said. Elisha delivered the message, send him here to me, so he will know that there is a prophet. Not, send him here to me so I can heal him. It's not about Elisha. Elisha knows that. It's about God. The purpose isn't to heal. All right? That's what's going to happen. The purpose isn't to heal. It's not about Naaman. It's not about Elisha. It's not about either one of them. It's about revealing God's power and mercy. That's where this is going. Verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. Now, who rides with horses and chariots? Think about that. Who rides with horses and chariots? It's soldiers. So here's these instruments of war rolling through Israel. Like, imagine like our enemies rolling through Bethlehem. Like, I'm think of an enemy country. You don't have to say it out loud, but an enemy country rolling through New Bethlehem with tanks and the cavalry, we would think something's up. We would be very intimidated. At least I would. I mean, I think some of us would go to arms, but I can't do much against a tank. Here's your enemy rolling through with chariots and horses, these instruments of war, this entourage of Naaman's, very frightening, I'm guessing. And they're arriving at Elisha's door with this flourish of style. Clanking steel, hooves of horses, these chariots clanking around. Very impressive, no doubt. No doubt it's very impressive. Verse 10, and Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. I love it. Elisha's not impressed. Right? Like, if some foreign army shows up at my door, I'm probably going to go greet them. Like, I'd be impressed to see this foreign army at my doorstep. He doesn't even go and greet the procession himself. He sends this messenger. And the 7, when he says, go do that 7 times, go wash 7 times, it's no accident. He's not just pulling a random number from the sky. In Hebrew culture, there is this symbolic nature to the number 7, which a lot of you probably already know. 7 is the most important, the Sabbath day, the day of rest. Among many laws, there's many, many laws dealing with 7 in the Bible. So it's no accident he's saying, go wash in the Jordan 7 times. Verse 11. But Naaman was angry, and he went away saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. And Naaman's expecting Elisha to come out and greet him. And what does he get? He gets the messenger. And he figured Elisha would call upon the name and wave his call upon the name of his Lord and wave his magic wand. And that's very frustrating for Elisha. It's got to be very frustrating because he is this very important man, remember, back in his own land. And there's this Elisha, this almost nobody to him, and he's sending a messenger when he expected him to come out and cure him. Very humiliating. No doubt his soldiers are watching all this too, which would make it even more humiliating. Verse 12. Are not Abram and Pharpar the rivers of Damascus? Damascus is back in Syria. Aren't the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. You brought me all this way, and the cure is to go wash in the river Jordan? Weren't my rivers good enough? Could I just not have stayed home and done this exact same thing? What he was missing is this. It's not the river. Right? The river Jordan isn't magical. It's not magic water in there. There wasn't a spell cast over the water. It was submitting to the will of God. That was what was important. That's what mattered. In verse 13, but his servants, this is Naaman, right? His servants came near and said to him, my father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? A servant has to bring Naaman down a notch. Not a prideful person, somebody humble had to approach Naaman and say something like this. Like, he didn't tell you to do something difficult. If he told you to do something difficult, wouldn't you have tried it to get rid of leprosy? Like, seriously, just go wash in the river Jordan and be clean. So verse 14, so he went down and he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he was clean. So here's my final thoughts on what all this means. 1, God can use anyone for his purposes, but sometimes we have to speak up. This little slave girl who was a person of God. She was a chosen person of God. She was a little Jewish girl. Like, she could have just shut up. She could have just said nothing. Knowing what God can do, the power of the Lord, she could have just been quiet, but she didn't. She spoke up for God. And God's getting ready to use her. He used this small, weak, when I want to say a little insignificant little girl, to point to the power of healing. She knew that there was a prophet in Elisha, and God can help Naaman. She didn't have to do this. My tendency would have been, let him rot. Here's your enemy. Just let him rot. Like, who cares if he dies of leprosy? That's terrible to admit, but that might be our inner tendency. He's an enemy. He took me. He enslaved me. Like, he ripped me from my family. Just let him rot of leprosy. That might have been my tendency. This man, he sent me here to die. But her tendency was to speak up. She was brave. I have this opportunity to showcase the living God's power, and she took that opportunity, which I found fascinating. The second thing I get from all this is don't miss out on what God's doing right before your very eyes. And this is an odd one, because in Luke, Jesus tells people in his own hometown, God could have cured the Israelites, his chosen people who suffered with leprosy. But who did he choose to save? A Syrian, a pagan. Jesus is telling this because these particular Jews strayed far away from God, and they were missing out on what was happening right in front of their very eyes. Miracles, healings, fulfilled prophecy, yet they still had doubt, and yet they still had condemnation. And Jesus pointed that out. They missed out what was happening in front of their very eyes. And the last thing, that I think the most important thing, is there's no man-made cure for sin. Naaman was toast. And the guy was going to die of leprosy. There was no cure. His days were numbered. It was going to happen. Sin has that same effect on us. It rots us to the core. It makes us loathsome. Sometimes it's in our plain effect in what we see, just like leprosy. Sometimes it's more like in our inner effect, in our spirit, whether it's manifest in anxiety, alcoholism, anger, depression. That's the effect that sin can have on us. Either way, it's known and it's vile to God, just as leprosy was vile to man. Just like the power to cure leprosy was God's, so is the power to cure sin. So that's what I get out of all that. And I'm going to pray to end this, and then we're going to sing one hymn, 340. So in your hymnal, go to go to page 340, or hymn 340, and let me pray while we're doing that. Heavenly Father God, I thank you. I thank you for your word to give us these occurrences to showcase your power. They're your power over everything, your power over sin, your power to deal with us the way you see fit. That the word of God isn't about us and our glory. It's all pointing to you, your glory, your mercy upon us. That you can use the saved and the unsaved for your purposes, that keep our eyes open to what's happening, to what you are doing, and how you manifest in our lives, and how we can serve you with humility and humbleness, Lord. I thank you for that. And I pray in your heavenly name, amen. So hymn 340, this is the hymnal here.